about sort of learning that sticks, I think about this phenomenon that's happening in New York City. There's a really interesting thing going on in classrooms in public schools in New York City right now. Hopefully many of you have heard about the musical, the big Broadway musical, Hamilton. It's become this international sensation. It won like 11 Tony Awards. Apparently scalpers can get like $1,000 per ticket. And it's, if you haven't heard about it, it's created by a gentleman named Lin-Manuel Miranda. And it takes the true story of Alexander Hamilton's life and translates it into this hip-hop, rap-based musical with a cast of Latino, African-American, and Asian actors. The idea behind it is to tell the story of America then with people from America now. And it's just been really, really, really fresh. And an institute in New York called the Gilder Lehrman Institute recognized the potential of this way of sort of teaching American history as being something that could really land and stick with kids in the New York City public schools. And so they partnered together and they created a curriculum. And James Basker, the president of the Institute, worked with the Hamilton executives to create this new curriculum that focused on early American history. And as part of the curriculum, these Black and Latino and Asian and white students from New York public city schools get to go for free to the Broadway show. And James Basker says, you know, there's no one single way to teach American history. In education, imagination is the most important thing. If you can't capture and excite the imagination of students, they're never going to care about your subject. So I think the takeaway lesson from what's going on in the New York City public schools using the musical Hamilton is that taking the time to invest in some outside-of-the-box ideas, trying to do things a little bit fresh, trying to mix things up a little bit, really is a task worth doing. It's worth investing in, because then the content really lands and really sticks, really stays with our students. Now, much of the teaching that's done in our educational institutions follows kind of a traditional paradigm that we might call the sage on the stage, the lecturer up front giving a lecture. And I'm not going to knock that pedagogy at all, because I think it's actually a very valuable, very worthwhile, very legitimate pedagogy. I mean, people go to school and they learn lots of things, and the people sitting in the classroom, frankly, know less than the person up in the front. And it's a good thing for the person up in the front to be teaching. And it's a very effective pedagogy, I think, for transferring information. So I'm not going to knock that pedagogy at all. I'm simply going to say that in addition to that model, there are other kinds of pedagogical possibilities that can help us not just transfer information, but help us accomplish a number of other objectives that I think as Christian educators we would all agree that we care about. We want the students to not only get it, but to get it well enough to be able to teach it to others. We want the students to not only hear the information, but to recognize how this biblical truth that they're learning really impacts their lives and changes them, hopefully in ways that is profound enough that they learn how to transform and help other people change. We want our seminary students in particular to learn these important pieces of information that we're trying to share in a way that they can weave it into pastoral counseling once they're off in their pastoral ministry. And we want them to get some of these ideas so into their own personal DNA that they're able to use their influence and platform in their various spheres of ministry to change the DNA of their organizations and put this sort of thing into the cultural DNA of those organizations. And so in order to accomplish not just information transfer, but some of these other learning objectives, I think we need the sage on the stage, and we need some other pedagogical possibilities. Well, I've come up with 5 ideas, and I've given them kind of corny names just in the hope that the corny names will sort of help you remember them a little bit. And I've called the first one, Bring in the Dog. The second one is the Nike slogan, Just Do It. The third one, Come and See. The fourth one, Cross the Border. And the fifth one, Fresh Response. And the ideas that I'm going to share about, some of them come from professors from ON schools. Some of them come from professors of seminaries not yet in the ON. Some of them come from friends of mine who are educators in various sorts of situations. Some of them are my own things that I've tried out. So the first one I call Bring in the Dog. Bring in the dog. And all I mean by that is make a teaching point particularly three-dimensional by bringing in something into the classroom. Bring in an artifact, bring in a visual, bring in a video, bring in a panel, bring in a person. The reason I call it Bring in the Dog is because my best friend is a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. And she teaches a class on criminal procedure almost every year. She calls it the Law and Order class, you know. And one of the really cool things that she does when she has the lesson on search and seizure, she has the police guys that run the canine unit. She has one of those officers come into the classroom with the dog, with the drug-sniffing dog, and teach the class about, you know, all the policies and procedures about doing lawful search and seizure. And as the quote from her reflects, you know, this bringing in the dog and seeing the police handler and hearing about how this actually works out, you know, it really makes it three-dimensional. It really makes it come alive to her students. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that you bring in a dog, although I'm a big animal person, so if I was in seminary, I'd be all over somebody bringing a dog into class. And frankly, I remember the live nativity scenes when I was a child, and I can tell you that really made the Christmas story stick for me, being able to, you know, see the donkeys and the sheeps. It was great. But what about other ways of sort of bringing in the dog? Let's suppose that you were to bring in a panel of marketplace Christians. When I think about the sorts of things that Tom was talking about this morning, about fruitfulness, about capacity, imagine having someone like Dr. Jorge Vasquez come into your classroom. He's an oceanographer with NASA. And the reason he's an oceanographer is because when he grew up, his father just instilled in him an incredible love for creation and an incredible sense of how, as a believer, we are to be people who tend and take care of God's beautiful creation. You could bring somebody like that into your classroom. Imagine teaching on Genesis, teaching on the cultural mandate, tending and caring for the garden, and then having somebody like him talk about his experience. Or maybe bring in someone like Leah Driscoll. She's a social entrepreneur in Minneapolis. She actually won a social enterprise competition in Minneapolis. Her idea was to take a city bus and completely remodel it and turn it into a mobile grocery store. And then it drives around into all the food deserts neighborhoods in Minneapolis. Imagine if you were teaching an Old Testament class and you were talking about God's heart for the poor and God's heart for the hungry, and you were teaching about the gleaning regulations. Wouldn't it be cool to have somebody like Leah Driscoll come in and tell you about what she's doing as a believer to bring food to the hungry? Or what about a guy like Alfonso de Luna? Alfonso is the owner of something called Ponchi's Auto Shop in Princeton, Texas. But he's not only a Christian business owner, he's also an ex-felon. When he was a young man, he got messed up with drugs, and he ended up spending some time in prison. Praise the Lord, he got through that period of time in his life, and he came to Christ, and his church really loved on him. And in fact, they helped him with a loan to get his business started up. And now he's this incredible, compassionate, and just businessman who tries to offer affordable car repair to the folks that come to him. And he has hired young men that have substance abuse backgrounds. And he's trained them and taught them how to be certified auto mechanics and given them good jobs in his shop. Imagine you were doing a class on the wisdom literature and you're teaching about what the Proverbs have to say about the just business person. And then having somebody like Alfonso, share his story. I think it would make things really, really come alive. And you could imagine, asking questions that I think resonate with some of the things we heard this morning from our speakers. Questions like, well, tell us how your work contributes to helping other people to thrive, just like Reverend Leslie helped others to thrive. How does your work advance justice? How does your work enable you to pursue that neighborly love that Tom was talking about? How does your work contribute to tending and keeping the garden? So bring in the dog. Second pedagogical possibility is what I call just do it. And what I'm talking about there, of course, is sort of experiential learning or learning by doing. What are you going to do to put this learning into practice? Because again, we don't want students just to sort of memorize information. What we want them to do is understand it in a very deeply personal way and to actually practice and live it out. So when I think about Kahn's talk, about this tension of being in the world but not of the world, and what does it look like to live in the midst of that tension, I think of this really interesting book that I had a chance to read recently. It's a book by a pastor named Daniel Harrell. He's actually a professor at Bethel Seminary. He's also the pastor of Colonial Church in Edina, Minnesota. But before he was in Minnesota, he was the senior pastor at a church in Boston called Park Street Church. And he's written this book called How to Be Perfect. And it's a delightful book. And what it does is it tells the story of how he and 19 of his congregants at Park Street Church for 1 month attempted to actually live in accordance with all of the rules and regulations of the book of Leviticus. They didn't do real great, honestly. But it's just a fascinating account of how he and these fellow believers were trying to understand, what were the reasons underneath these various rules and regulations, because some of them sound a little bit weird, frankly, right? And trying to figure out what they were for. It allowed them to have to do the hard work of translating, okay, well, here was a rule or regulation that was, embodied in a particular time frame and context and history. Well, if we get to the spirit of that, what would that look like trying to translate that into our modern day practices? And the book is just filled with stories of how they, attempted to do this. And it's actually hilarious at various points. He's a very wonderful, winsome writer. So imagine assigning your students to read chapter 3 of the book How to Be Perfect. It's the chapter that's all about all the sacrificial offerings, all those offerings of bulls and rams and lambs and grain and all these sorts of things. And then ask your students, it was a big deal to sacrifice your perfect bull. I mean, that was something that was a prized economic possession. That cost you something to sacrifice. Remember when somebody tried to give David some animals and then he said, no, I will not sacrifice to the Lord something that has not cost me. So imagine assigning your students, come up with some sort of sacrifice that you would make. And then come back to class and give us an oral report on what did you choose to sacrifice, why did you choose to sacrifice it, and what's going on in your life because of that. Wouldn't that make teaching the book of Leviticus really come alive? I think maybe it would. It would really help them understand, wow, we are called to be set apart people. We are called to be those people that live in the tension of chosen sojourners. And we need to think about what that would look like in real practice. I think if we could figure out how to make our students sacrifice a bull, that would help with that. My third pedagogical possibility I call come and see. And again, I realize, these ideas probably really aren't rocket science, and many of you have already done things like this. But all I mean by come and see is, when possible, take them out of the classroom. Take them on a little field trip. Go see something. Go meet somebody in their workplace. Go to a place. Bruce Fields talked a lot about the Imago Dei, and it strikes me, I haven't had the privilege of going to seminary myself. I wish that I had. But it seems to me that there's probably an awful lot that gets talked about the Imago Dei in seminaries. Probably lots of different courses end up talking about that particular theme, because it's just so crucial, right? It's just crucial to the doctrine of man, and the doctrine of God, and the doctrine of creation, and just all kinds of things. When we think about the doctrine of the Imago Dei, we know that it has tremendous implications for work, right? We image God through our work because God is a worker. And we also know that every human being has incredible inherent dignity because every human being is made in the image of God. And work has incredible dignity. All work, whether it's work that's esteemed in the eyes of this broken and fallen world or not, work has this incredible dignity. And so as we think about the Imago Dei, we think about everything from how do we find workplaces that guard human dignity, that create the kinds of just and right conditions for human creativity, as opposed to workplaces that just sort of treat people as though they were machines or cogs in a wheel, because we're not cogs in a wheel. But also we think about the dignity of every individual, including individuals who have physical or mental disabilities. So as you're teaching about the image of God, what if you were to go and visit a sheltered workshop? What if you were to go to contact the Goodwill or one of these other places in your community and take your students there and have them watch as people that have mental or physical disabilities are finding incredible dignity as they get to work. And listen to them tell you about what it means to them to be able to work and to contribute. I think that could be a profound experience that would make students walk away with a really three-dimensional idea of what it means to live out the cultural mandate, and the fact that the cultural mandate is for everyone, including people that have different kinds of disabilities. Also, you could take people to workplaces owned by Christian business owners. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to go out to Azusa Pacific University, and there was a professor there who had taken one of his classes out to see some different workplaces, and one of them was Cerenzia Foods, owned by this gentleman here, Joe Annunziato. And they went, and it's a firm that basically provides food to restaurants. So it's a wholesaler, and then they provide foods for restaurants and delis. And Joe Annunziato is this really incredible Christian business person who's really thought well about what it means to be a just employer. He's really thought well about how to organize his workplace in a way that does, in fact, guard human dignity. He's tried to make the workplace a very family-friendly kind of situation. And he's also a very generous business owner. One of the things that they do is provide free food and a medical mobile van that goes out on a monthly basis into some of the poorer neighborhoods in his community. And I had the opportunity to interview some of the students that were in this class who had been able to go on this field trip. And one of the gals said, my biggest aha moment in this class was when we went to go visit Joe at his warehouse. We spent time with him and his employees, and it just all really began to connect to me to see how his business really was a ministry. It was really an aha moment for that student. Another student named David said, Visiting that food guy was one of the most wonderful conversations I've ever had. Hearing his passion and seeing his warehouse and operations and then hearing about all the people he hired, it was like, holy crap, this guy's got the best ministry I've ever seen, and it's a business. And as a future pastor, he said to me, he said, you know, and this I think could really change our ideas as pastors. He said, because I think as pastors, usually what we do with businesses is we go to Joe Annunziato and we say, hey, Joe, what can you do for our church? And going on this workplace visit had caused that to flip for him. He had realized this guy was doing incredible ministry, and as a pastor, what he should be doing is going to Joe and saying, how can I affirm you in the ministry that you're doing? How can the church support you in what you're doing? Because what you're doing is really so powerful. So these workplace visits, boy, this come and see, it lands, it sticks. Well, the fourth pedagogical possibility I'll tell you about I call cross the border. And all I mean there is that we think about ways in which we can deliberately expose our students to people or to places that they might not otherwise sort of naturally interact amongst. Crossing the border. Getting us out of our own bubbles, getting us out of our own homogeneity circles. Now, I want to recognize quickly, I realize not everybody that's in your schools is a white middle-class kid, okay? I realize that seminaries and Christian liberal arts schools have tried very hard, particularly in the last few decades, to really go after minority students. It's great, and we're seeing ever-increasing diversity in our schools, both racially, with international students, and students of different economic levels, and that is totally awesome. All I'm saying with this cross the border is that we need to think about where can we show people life experiences that are somewhat different from their own life experiences. And it's the case that probably still the majority of our students are often, frankly, from a little bit more privileged backgrounds. They're more probably middle class families and kids. So what would it look like? Well, when I think about Tom talking about, neighbor love and what it means to be a church that's able to see that economic distress, able to see it like Jesus saw it, is to see it and have it kick you in the guts and really make you respond with a deep sense of compassion. Well, in Waco, Texas, my friend Jimmy Dorrell, who's a professor at Truett Seminary at Baylor University, one of the things he does with his students is he helps them cross the border by taking them into some of the tougher neighborhoods of Waco. Now, frankly, it's pretty easy for Jimmy to do that because in addition to being a professor at Baylor, he's also the executive director of a wonderful, very holistic, very comprehensive ministry called Mission Waco. So he has ministry to the homeless, for example, and so the seminary students come and they have breakfast with homeless people. But you could find a local ministry partner, a local nonprofit that's active, maybe a CDC doing community development, maybe a church that's doing a wonderful holistic work in a side of town that is economically struggling, and you could ask them, could we come and could you sort of teach us? Could we come and listen? Could we come and learn from you? Could we expose ourselves to things that maybe we haven't seen? And it would be really neat if before you actually went out and did a little tour like that with your students, if you gave them an assignment to learn about the community. Get them thinking about ways that they could learn about communities, like going to the historical society in your community and trying to find out about the history of that particular neighborhood. Or identifying whether there are what's commonly referred to as alternative newspapers in your community. I use that word with a little bit of hesitation, but that's sort of the word that's chosen. There are a lot of times papers that are written specifically for African American or Latino populations in a community, and they're sort of known as alternative newspapers. And to read those and to listen to that perspective it's a wonderful thing. Or invite a pastor in from the community that you're going to go and visit, and have that person come to class and share a little bit with your students about that. But going out and crossing the border, what a great thing to do for a missions course. But what also a great thing to do in any kind of course where you're talking about race, you're talking about poverty, you're talking about inequality, any of those sorts of issues. Or what about a church planting class? I mean, church planters need to know how to really exegete communities and do that through gaining wisdom about those communities from a very wide-ranging assortment of resources. Now, this kind of an assignment would be the sort of thing that would really, I think, get their juices flowing in learning about those sorts of things. Okay, so my final pedagogical possibility I call fresh response. And I would imagine that in many of our institutions, a traditional sort of homework assignment or classroom assignment is the response paper, right? You teach a body of material, and then the students are supposed to write a research paper about it or some sort of reflection paper about it. Maybe they're supposed to do a sermon based on the material. And again, nothing wrong. That's a great assignment, and that's a good thing to do. But maybe that could be freshened up a little bit. What are some fresh ways that you could ask students to interact with the material and respond back to you about it? Well, my first idea about this, I'm actually borrowing from the Theology of Work project. If you were to go on the Theology of Work website and read some of their commentaries, they've got a really wonderful section there now. There's like a button, I think. Ask Will Messenger about it, but you can go onto a place that I think is for educators or scholars, and it's talking about different types of classroom assignments that you could make. And one of the really neat ones that they've come up with has to do with an assignment that you would give if you were teaching students from the book of Ruth. And the assignment has two parts to it. The first one is that you tell the students, go and find kind of a traditional commentary on the book of Ruth and read sections of that. And then compare and contrast that with the Theology of Work Project's commentary on the book of Ruth. And take a good look at that. But then secondly, and this is the part that's kind of really neat, rather than writing a paper about these sorts of things, what if you had the students really study what's going on economically and the way that God has made provision in his law to take care of a sojourner like Ruth and her mother-in-law who come back? What would it look like if you took those ideas and you wrote them up in the form of a bill? Of a legislative proposal that you would put forward, to your state. And I actually Googled, and you can do this. You could just Google the phrase template legislative bill or sample legislative bill. And you'll find a whole bunch of sites that will pop up on the very first page of your results, and they'll actually provide you like a little template of what a real piece of legislation is supposed to look like. There's sort of a preamble, and then you're supposed to sort of state the rationale for your idea, and then you write the body of what your idea is. So instead of having them write a response paper about this, have them actually put their hat on as policymakers and have them write up a bill talking about what they would do if they were trying to take not only the principles found in the book of Ruth, but all of the rich wisdom that comes from the Old Testament in particular as it relates to social justice and how we can care for the needy among us. So that would be one possibility. The second one is another one that I kind of somewhat borrowed from the Theology of Work. One of the neat things about the Theology of Work project is that they contend, and I think it's a beautiful contention, they contend that every single book of the Bible has something to say about work. Even the book of Song of Songs, which I think is a pretty radical contention. But I've become convinced after I read their stuff about it. Because what they say in their commentary on the book of Song of Songs is that not only is this, it's love poetry, it's all kinds of things are going on in that book, right? There's the analogy between God and his bride, and there's the relationship between the lover and his beloved. But it's not just about the relationship. This is what the Theology of Work project argues. Quote, "Song of Songs is about a couple who start a small business as a way to make a living and strengthen their love. Their work draws them together rather than keeping them apart. This book shows work and family life not as a balance of competing priorities, but as an integrated way of achieving what is most important in life." So the assignment that they suggest at Theology of Work is another one of these, read a kind of a regular commentary or a traditional commentary on the Song of Songs, then read the Theology of Work commentary on the Song of Songs, and write some sort of reflections comparing and contrasting the two. To that, I would add a little bit of a different idea. Again, with the idea being that we want the things that we teach in the classroom to really get into the DNA of our people. So they take this life-giving knowledge and they put it into actual practice. What if you were to say to your students, read Song of Songs, read the Theology of Work's commentary on the Song of Songs, and then write a paper that reflects your own vision for your life? How are you going to live a life where your work and your family is sort of seamlessly integrated? If this, in fact, is a vision that God is putting forward in the Song of Songs for thriving and for a very beautiful life, what would that look like for you? Some of your students are already married and have children, and so they can, really think, what are they doing right now and what could they adjust? Others of you are going to have single students. They can also sort of anticipate the future. I'm not married, but I still have to have a balance of family and work and how to integrate those things, because I have responsibilities as a sister, as a daughter. So what if you were to give your students the assignment of sort of sketching out a vision paper for themselves about what would their own lives look like? What vision do they have? Write a mission statement. And you could tell them to do this according to what are known in the business world as SMART goals. SMART is just an acronym for certain kinds of goals. SMART stands for goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So they would write this paper, and instead of just sort of waxing, eloquent about all these totally unrealistic things that they're going to do with their lives, they would actually be grounded in what can you actually do, and be really specific about it. Give some specific examples. Again, I think that's the kind of assignment that could really help students take the material and really wrestle with it in a way where they're thinking about how are they gonna live this out. And for our seminary students, the more that we can get them thinking about how they're working this out in their own lives, we're preparing them, aren't we, to disciple their flock as they think about how they're gonna try to live in this sort of way. So those are my pedagogical possibilities. Bring in the dog, cross the border, come and see, just do it, and think about some fresh response. So bring in the dog, this idea of trying to make something three-dimensional by bringing in other voices, artifacts, visuals, you name it. I want to, for this, suggest the use of those wonderful economic wisdom TED-like talks. You saw a preview of those before I was up here last time, and you heard a lot of really wonderful testimony from your colleagues about how they've made use of those in the classroom. These are, relatively short video resources. There are 7 of them available already. You can get them by going to the ON app and hitting on the resource tabs. They're also available for you on the ON's YouTube channel. I have to be really impressed by that. Like, the ON has its own YouTube channel. Like, you guys are just so hip. That's awesome. You could tell that they were very, very well done, very well produced, really, really high quality, great teachers on great topics, on timeless subjects that are of interest in so many different kinds of settings. Your class settings in theological education talks about the image of God, about the mission of the church, talks about vocation, talks about the great commandment. Taking these timeless theological truths and then applying them to topics that students are really energized by and animated by, whether it's cultural renewal or the fight for justice, addressing poverty, dealing with the political divisions in our society, the family, et cetera, et cetera. So the people giving these talks, some of them are the very best in their fields. So this is just a fantastic resource to bring in a fresh resource that I think will really capture the attention of your students. In addition to the bring in the dog, let's talk another way of thinking about this. Really appreciated Mark Roberts and his discussion with us about how vocation and calling is so relevant to the important callings in the household, the callings of parenting, of being a mom, of being a dad, as well as how single people like myself are also implicated in those callings, because we all have an opportunity to participate in the raising of children. So when you're talking about vocation, one thing you might consider doing is, I think these MOPS group, they're called Mothers of Preschoolers. They seem to be ubiquitous in just about every community that I visit. Some church will have a MOPS ministry in that locality. And I think it would be a really interesting thing if you were to bring in some women who have made the choice of staying at home, and they see that role in the household very much as a vocation. And getting them to reflect on that, to reflect on how they think about that theologically, probing them, asking them, what kinds of spiritual disciplines do you try to practice that help you in this? What are the sorts of teaching that you have heard through Bible studies, through preaching, et cetera, that you have found particularly helpful to you in conceiving of homemaking as a vocation? Getting them to talk about how do you, as a parent, try to instill in your children the notion that we are to seek first the kingdom of God. One of the things that amazes me about moms is that moms are, and dads, but they're terrific educators, right? Because they have to take really important concepts and then they have to, bring them down into accessible form. So they're really very, very good teachers. So what if you were to have a couple of ladies from a MOPS ministry come in and share with your class about that? But then also you could invite my friend Caitlin Beatty to maybe visit your class via Skype. Caitlin is the author of a really wonderful book that came out last year called A Woman's Place. And it's just a terrific book. Caitlin is the former managing editor at Christianity Today. And it's a book where she really is unpacking, in particular, Psalm 8, and what it means that human beings are called to rule, and what it means that women are participants in that vocation of ruling in the world. And she's thought really, really well about that, and she's interviewed in the book many, many different women from various ages and stages, with perhaps a little bit more of a focus on women who are out in the paid working marketplace. And so to bring in this kind of menu of women's voices talking about vocation into your classroom, I think could be a very powerful way teaching on these things. And then you could have assign your students to write a sermon on Psalm 8 and reflect on what they've heard from women who've made a variety of choices about the different ways in which they're leaning in to their callings. Well, second pedagogical possibility I called cross the border. Cross the border. And you'll remember that the general idea here was simply to try to kind of bridge various divides to get people talking and get people interacting with folks maybe from different life experiences. And one of the divides I think, frankly, that needs to sometimes be crossed is the clergy-laity divide. It's not always the case that pastors Matt Rustin was confessing earlier that, as a young pastor, he was wonderfully theologically trained, but he didn't quite understand often the ordinary, real-life, day-to-day experiences out in the workplace that his congregations were facing. So when I think of things like Celeste was talking about and how folks experience all kinds of different difficulties in their work lives. What if you were to assign students to think about the congregants in the church that they are involved in? Some of your students I know are actually part-time students and they're ministering in a church setting, so it might be their church that they're shepherding, or they might be a full-time seminary student, but they're involved in a local church. But get them to sit down with two congregants from the church, preferably one male, one female, preferably not people who are church officers, preferably people that have full-time jobs outside of Christian organizations. And sit down with those folks one-on-one for 15 or 20 minutes and just really ask them to reflect on this question. What challenging issue are you currently facing on your job, or an issue that's been difficult for you in the past, in this job or another one? What challenging issue would you like to hear a leader from this church discuss in a sermon or in an adult education class? This was actually a homework assignment that we gave to congregational leaders in a learning community that I had the privilege of helping to lead, called the Vocation Infusion Learning Community, where we brought congregational leaders from a variety of churches around the country together. And we sent them out in between a couple of our face-to-face retreats doing this as a homework assignment. And it was really revolutionary for them. They were able to really get a three-dimensional picture of some of the struggles that their congregants faced, and they were able to listen to those congregants, sort of tell them, advise them on, what are the sorts of topics you ought to be talking about that, really will be very relevant to folks like me. But not only that you should talk about them, but here's sort of how you could talk about them, or here's the particular kinds of dilemmas that we're facing, that we're seeking your pastoral wisdom on. And so doing those sorts of interviews, I think, could be really helpful. And then you could have the students write down their notes from those conversations about what they've learned, share those in a classroom setting. Be a great thing, I think, for a class on preaching, for example, and then maybe to have them construct a sermon that's meant to address the issues that were raised in those interviews that they did with their congregants. So crossing the clergy-laity divide. Another one in this category is a really interesting assignment called Partner in Observation. This is an assignment that is used and has been used now for about 5 years by one of my pastors at Trinity Presbyterian Church. His name is Reverend Wade Bradshaw. And our church runs a program that some of you may be familiar with. It's called the Trinity Fellows Program. And there's a variety of fellows programs around the country. What it is a program where recent college graduates come to come to a community, come to a church, and they take seminary-level classes. They work part-time internships in various marketplace jobs, and they serve in the church by helping out with the discipleship ministries of that church. Our church has been running a fellows program for a number of years, and Wade, who is our associate pastor, is the seminary professor teaching the classes to the students. And he teaches a class called Issues in Contemporary Culture. And before I describe to you exactly what the Partners in Observation assignment is, let me just take a moment to kind of explain the context for it. Obviously, we are teaching in the midst of a particular cultural moment. The sociologist James Davison Hunter calls our moment late modernity. And it's marked by everything from a skepticism of truth with a capital T to the dismissal of claims about an enduring sense of the human person. It's marked by a nihilistic sense of time, that there's not really any meaning in history, and history isn't going anywhere. It's marked by hyper-individualism. It's marked by hyper-materialism. This is the context that we're living in, and of course, Dr. Vince Baycoat spoke about some of these things and some of the challenges of living in this pluralistic post-Christian society. And most of the folks in our congregations are out there working in a workplace where these sorts of cultural ideas are very much in play. And so the idea of this Partner in Observation assignment is an attempt to help young Christian students that have just graduated from college and are preparing for their workplace careers to get them out of their Christian bubble and really get them in a relationship with someone that doesn't share the faith. So the assignment that is made is that each student needs to identify a non-Christian person who would agree to meet with them once a week for the course of the semester, either in person for short conversations once a week or on the phone, and having conversations about some of the different issues that come up over the course of the Issues in Contemporary Culture class that the students are taking. Now, I remember when I first heard of this assignment, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this must be a really challenging assignment. It's not like I could just whip up, a close non-Christian friend at the drop of a hat who would be willing to get together with me, once a week. But I want to tell you that, he's been doing this for more than 5 years, and it works, and every student has been able to identify somebody that's been willing to get together with them. So that suggests to me that people are willing to talk about things that matter. So what happens is the students, during the course of the week, are introduced to a particular topic during the course of that week's lecturing in the class. And then Wade provides them with a question or two that they are to take and sort of throw out there for discussion, typically over coffee. That's why all the pictures are about coffee. 20-somethings are nutso about coffee. I don't know what that's all about. Maybe you guys are nutso about coffee. But to have these conversations about these sorts of issues. So some of the questions, here are some of the kinds of questions. Some of these are modified a little bit, but what are the most important values that shape your life? Do you think about what happens when you die, and does what you think about what happens when you die influence those values? We heard this morning that it's pretty important that we have a view of eschatology, because only a robust understanding of the next world is going to help us live fruitfully and faithfully in this world. So Christians should have a lot to say about that, and it'd be pretty interesting to hear what non-believers have to say about that. Or freedom, obviously, huge cultural good in our society, and yet And yet, there are different definitions of what freedom really means. So to talk to people about, well, how do you define freedom? Is freedom for you what I don't know. I don't know, Greg, whether you'd call John Stuart Mill a libertarian. You would know better than I. No, okay, but he was really into the lots of individual freedom, and the only freedom, you get to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't deprive other people of freedom. So all of these questions about what is freedom, what is dignity, what's the basis of dignity, what are the values that are really important to you that shape your life, very rich conversations can be had along these lines. I came up with some questions as well. What if you had decided that you wanted to do an assignment like this, but you wanted to have your students particularly discuss issues related to work with their partner in observation? So I came up with some questions along these lines. Why do you think people are satisfied or not satisfied in their work? What are the factors that make the difference? Have you ever experienced someone kind of showing you grace on the job? And you might have to explain exactly what you mean by being a recipient of grace, but getting people to talk about what that maybe looked like to them and what that experience was like, getting them to think with you about what are the underlying roots of workaholism, which is so pervasive in our society. Or what about this really interesting quote here where it talks about, this was from a secular business journal called the Business Insider, and the author was arguing people should leave behind selfish concerns about whether their job is ideal for them, instead work at really getting good at one thing. If you want to love what you do, abandon the question of what can the world offer me, and instead think, what can I offer the world? And having the partner in observation reflect on that. I found that quote just in itself really fascinating. That you would, this is very much a Christian way of viewing work, right? How can I serve through my work? Just goes to show that all truth really is God's truth. So there's all kinds of classes, I think, where this sort of assignment would be relevant. Obviously, if you're teaching any kind of class like Wade teaches about wrestling with church and society and issues in contemporary culture. I know Scott Ray teaches a fabulous course along those lines out at Talbot, because I've interviewed some of his students who have said, that's my favorite class I ever took at Talbot. Or other classes, New Testament classes, where one of the things that comes up is what the New Testament authors have to say about doing our work and doing our work heartily as unto God and not as unto man. So I think this could be really exciting. And I took a few moments to interview one of the students in Wade's course this year about her experience with the whole partners in observation thing. And this is what it's a little bit of a long quote, but this is what she had to say about going through this experience. And I hope as I read this that you'll really seriously consider making an assignment like this, because I think it's really quite powerful. So this is what the young woman said. Quote, "This was an amazing experience. The goal was not to convert. The goal was to develop deeper understanding of my own beliefs and the beliefs of others. The conversations that I had with my partner in observation didn't change my beliefs, but they did make me want to seek out more understanding of every topic that we discussed. I learned a lot about how to communicate my beliefs through this. This exercise encouraged me to dive deeper into Reverend Bradshaw's class. My partner in observation also really enjoyed the process. She said that she had never been asked these questions before, and she had never felt like a Christian wanted to hear her thoughts without trying to push back on her. It was a beautiful friendship by the end of the semester. So I would commend to you the possibility of doing something like the partner in observation assignment. All right, the next one is about just do it. I appreciated Vince's phrase about engaging our culture with imagination. For me, as someone who's been a practitioner for many years of Christian community development, for me, one of the ways that we engage our world with imagination is when we learn to look at the world through a certain kind of eyeglasses. When the eyeglasses or the lenses through which we see the world around us are capable of seeing not only problems but also possibilities, capable of seeing not only needs but also assets. Now, it is the case that many churches today are seeking to be positive socioeconomic influences in their communities. And, you know, as someone who this is part and parcel of my work, I celebrate that, and I'm delighted every time I learn of a church that's asking, how can we bless our community? How can we serve our community? How can we make a difference in our community? It's really wonderful. But we also know that churches make mistakes, and sometimes the ways in which we've tried to go about helping people have brought about harm to people. And I'm using those words very deliberately, and I am referencing the book When Helping Hurts by my friends Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert. As our theological schools and as some of you that are teaching in other settings outside of seminary, where you're talking to your poli-sci students or your social work students, these future leaders of our churches, both clergy and lay, they want to make a difference. They want their churches to make a positive difference. And I believe that one of the really important skills that we need to be teaching is the skill of seeing communities not just for their needs, like, oh, we need to do a needs assessment because our church should go in there and solve the problem and meet the needs of the people. That's only half of the equation. It's very, very important that we teach people about the assets that are latent in these various communities. So that part of the question is, how do we discover the assets that are latent in this community, come alongside and underneath people in the community, that they can be the authors of the destiny of transforming their communities. So this way of seeing, it's known in shorthand as ABCD, or asset-based community development. And it's an approach to community ministry that emphasizes the biblical concept of community and the biblical truth that all people, including those who are allegedly, quote, on the wrong side of the tracks, all people have God-given gifts and talents that can be mobilized for the betterment of their neighborhoods. And so I would love to see some of you encourage your students to actually practice asset-based community development. And there's a couple of fairly simple assignments that you could give if you were, again, if you're teaching a class on missions, if you're teaching a church planting class, if you're teaching a class that deals with sort of the church's role in society. And I would say that this assignment would have a couple parts to it. One is they would all benefit very much from reading a relatively short essay. I think it's about 8 or 9 pages long. And it's called An Introduction to Asset-Based Community Development for Church Leaders. It's by Jay Van Groningen, and it's downloadable at the website of a group called Communities First Association. And so if you just Google Communities First Association, you'll get to their website. You'll be able to find the little tab that says Tools, and you'll scroll down and you'll see that essay there. And it's not just an essay. It's actually kind of an interactive thing where the reader is reading it, and throughout the essay, he'll get to the end of a subsection, and then there'll be an opportunity to reflect, to answer discussion questions and that sort of thing, and then you move on to the next section and continue doing the same. It's just a great way of introducing this, frankly, really big subject in a very digestible, kind of bite-sized bit for your students. Because after all, it's not like your students need to become experts in community development, right? That's not the point here. But it's really good for them to at least become a little bit conversant in what I think and what many practitioners of Christian community development believe are really, really important ways of thinking about how do we effectively serve our communities. So the assignment could start by simply encouraging the students to read that essay and to interact with it along the way that those discussion questions facilitate. But then on the theme of just do it, you could also actually have your students do an exercise that the Communities First Association calls a community walking exercise. And again, at the Communities First Association, you can find all of the directions for this, the instructions for how you set this up, and print those out. This was an assignment that I had some years ago. I had the opportunity of working with Trevecca Nazarene University. They asked me to spend some time with them building a new center called the Center for Social Justice. And so I was working with their educators and faculty on coming up with what the classes would be for a new major called a major in social justice. And then I was also working with different professors thinking through what we're thinking through today, which is how could you take a class you're already teaching, but tweak it or weave in some new emphases within the class or new assignments in the class that would be very relevant to what we were trying to, kind of the ideas that we were trying to put forward in this new social justice major. And the community walking exercise is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You take students, you put them in small groups of 3 to 5 people. They have a little cheat sheet that the Communities First Association provides. And then you kind of give them a walking map of a community. So you could get in touch with the leader of a nonprofit organization in your community, particularly people that are involved in community development corporations, for example, where they're focusing their ministries on a particular neighborhood. You could say, give me a map of your target neighborhood. You could go to them and you could say, I want to bring some students by. Could you help me figure out a 30-minute walking trail that they could take to walk around the community? And I actually did that in Nashville and kind of eyeballed out how the students could walk around the community. And what they do as they walk, the whole idea is that they're trying to have these eyeglasses where they're in an economically distressed neighborhood, and it's pretty simple to see the problems. It's pretty easy to spot the decay, the boarded up buildings, you know, trash, people that are idle, all these different things that we sort of associate with, you know, what's wrong in poor communities. But this community walking exercise is meant to be something where they're deliberately walking along and they're trying to have their eyes focusing on where are the assets. You know, wait a minute, okay, so some of these storefronts, they don't look like they're in the best of condition, but wow, there's 4 businesses located here. You know, that's an important thing. They're walking around and they're going to notice some of those houses where maybe the house itself is a very modest home, but it's obvious that the person living there cares about their home. And they've planted flowers and the grass is neatly trimmed. And they've got a sense of pride in their home and they want beauty in their home. They might stumble across markers or announcements that tell them about community association meetings that are going to be happening. That's another asset that exists in communities where residents are gathering together for monthly neighborhood association meetings and the like. So this community walking exercise allows the students to sort of learn how to see their communities with a full set of eyeglasses instead of just one set that only sees the needs in the community, but also sees the assets. Again, I think a great kind of exercise to do with a variety of students. And all these assignments, some of them may sound like they're a lot of work on the front end, and probably some of them are a little bit of work on the front end. But they're things that are actually happening. They're things that other people actually have done. So they're not just pie in the sky. They are plausible ideas. And as I said at the very beginning of my first talk, I think it's worth it. It's worth it to put in the extra effort to come up with some of these sorts of creative exercises, because it's this kind of, I think it's these kinds of pedagogical experiences and classroom exercises that really are going to be memorable for your students and really cause the information and the material that you want them to get to really land and stick. Okay? All right, wrapping up here, the pedagogical possibility of fresh response. And in both of these, these are my last examples. Both of these are examples of an assignment where instead of writing a research paper or a term paper, what the students would be doing is a little bit different than that. So the first one that I was thinking about, again, kind of thinking a little bit about what Celeste Cranston talked about, a lot of seminary students are working, right? They're going to school maybe full-time, but they're also working part-time. And sometimes they might be working in a church context, but a lot of times they're just, kind of working at whatever job out there in the marketplace is helping them to help them pay for their tuition to go to your seminary. A lot of them are working as baristas and working in retail shops and working as receptionists and doing all different kinds of work out there in the world. And as you have them in your class, and as in your class topics about work surface up, whether that's a class on the book of Genesis when you're talking about the cultural mandate, or whether that's a class on the book of Revelation when you're thinking about, what's the work that's going to continue into the new heaven and the new earth? And what's that work going to look like? And how's that work going to be characterized? How about getting them to think about the work that they're doing right now? Not the work that they're going to be doing as a future pastor, but the work that they're actually doing right now. Because as I've interviewed seminary students, and I've had the opportunity to do that a little bit over the years, because I've been employed as a consultant to go out and look at some of the seminaries and see what kinds of programs you're doing. And I've had the opportunity to talk to students. And one of the things that is really interesting is that, often what the students will tell me from these ON schools where you guys have begun talking about faith and the integration of faith and work. And what they'll say to me is, I really thought, I'm here at, insert name of seminary, and I thought that was my main ministry. My main ministry right now is that I'm a student, preparing for the ministry. And then, on the side, I work as whatever. I deliver packages with UPS, or I'm a barista at the Starbucks. And I never saw that work as having anything to do with, quote unquote, my ministry. But as I've taken Dr. Gill's class or somebody else's class, and I've had my imagination stirred about these things, I'm starting to recognize that even that work I'm doing in the secular world, that work is ministry too. Well, if that's the case, if you have a lot of students, what about getting them to reflect on that work and to keep a journal about that work? Maybe a journal for 4 weeks or for 6 weeks, keeping an entry a couple of times a week. And you could ask them questions like, do you see this work as drudgery? Right, as we heard about in the parable of the prodigal father. It's, I think, a great title for that parable. Where is God in the midst of that work at UPS, at the library, at the Starbucks? How does your understanding of the gospel apply to how you go about the very daily, mundane tasks of this work? How do you, quote unquote, bring God into this daily work? What are the spiritual formation practices that you engage in so that you can see your work as a school of sanctification? Because work is a school of sanctification. And it's good for the students to reflect on that a little bit. So help them we talked about Song of Songs and how there's this sort of seamless integration of the life. Well, help your students that are part-time studying in seminary and part-time working in the world, help them achieve some of that seamless integration by getting them reflecting about the realities of their work that they're doing, by bringing the questions that they're wrestling with in the seminary, bringing those and reflecting on those as they relate to that work that they're doing. All right, final thing. This one I got from the ON has that really fabulous paper called the Economic Wisdom Project, and they have a paper that you can download and read. And what I'm thinking of with this particular assignment is, and this is another thing that we've done with our churches and the vocation and fusion learning community that has proven to be really, really helpful, and it really animated a lot of discussion. We give them a copy of that paper, the Economic Wisdom paper from the ON, which you can easily download from the ON's website. And then we also give them another essay by a gentleman from Tennessee. His name is Michael Rhodes, and he's written a very thoughtful paper that he calls Kingdom Economics. And we provide both of these resources to our congregational leaders, and we ask them to read both of them and to kind of interact with them, because there's places of agreement and places of contrast, and it gets them, really thinking about these things. That Michael Rhodes' paper is called Living in the Kingdom Economy, a Roadmap for Christian Economic Activity in the Modern World. And it's actually a paper that we have now uploaded to the Made to Flourish website. So you could download the paper on economic wisdom from the ON site and Michael's paper from the Made to Flourish website. But then instead of assigning students to do sort of a compare and contrast research paper, what about saying to them, what we want to do is we want you to wrestle with the ideas in these two papers, and we want you to write a short series of blog posts. I was really delighted. I tried to do some research of your various schools that are part of the ON, and I discovered that AGTS has a blog where they've got it's called the Discipleship Network, and this is a place where faculty and students are publishing their thoughts. And then another school, let me see if I can remember which one it was, sorry, Southeastern Baptist Seminary, so shout out for Southeastern Baptist Seminary. They have a website that's called the Intersect Project. Now, I don't know whether other seminaries already have these sorts of blogs. If you don't, why don't you talk to one of your colleagues at one of these schools? Because here's what I was thinking. If you write a research paper, you basically hand it in to the professor, and the professor is the only one that reads it. If you assign students to write a blog post, then lots of other people are going to read it, and lots of other students are going to read it. And you might just be surprised that the students might work harder writing the series of blog posts that are going to be read by all of their peers than they might in writing a paper that's just for you. This is a little trick, again, that I've learned from my friend, my best friend that teaches at the law school. She's discovered that this is a really wonderful little trick. Instead of just having the students submit their papers to her, they have to submit them to their colleagues. And she said, the quality of the writing really shot up as soon as I expected them to do that. So if your school has a blog, what about assigning students to interact with materials like the ones I've just mentioned about the Economic Wisdom paper and Michael Rhodes' paper? But instead of a regular research paper, what about making them really wrestle with that, honing it down? I mean, if you have to write 4 blog posts that are each in the 800 to 1,000 words, you really have to understand that material, and then you have to be able to communicate it in a pretty sharp, succinct way. And I think you'll find that your students thinking about these things will be really quite honed in that sort of an assignment. Well, I've given you a lot to think about. These different pedagogical possibilities, as I've called them. And at the very beginning, I mentioned the musical Hamilton, which I've never been to see. I'm way too cheap. I would never pay $1,000 to see anything. Sorry. But if you're familiar with the musical, which I'm not, but I have a young 20-something who works for me and who is all about Hamilton. She couldn't have been more thrilled that I was going to mention Hamilton in this talk. She shared with me a lot of the music from Hamilton and all this stuff. And apparently one of the particularly popular songs from the musical is this song called "I'm Not Gonna Throw Away My Shot." And apparently the Alexander Hamilton character sings this particular hip-hop type song because he's this young, scrappy kid. He's an orphan, and he's grown up in the islands, and he's really, really intelligent. He's very hardworking, and some people recognize his potential, and so they send him off to an educational institution. They send him off to get trained at a good school. And he sings this song about how he's not going to throw away his shot. He's going to go, and he's going to learn and study, and he's going to make a splash. And he's going to really make a difference in this new world. And so just like Hamilton, in the song it says, "I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry." I want to encourage you as educators. Would you be scrappy and hungry? Would you recognize that your work matters? You know, we talk at these things about how everybody's work matters. Well, folks, your work really, really matters. You're the ones honing and shaping the future leaders, clergy and laity of our congregations. Yours is a sacred commission. You have some really special people that are under your authority, that you have stewardship over. Don't throw away your shot to influence them, to receive the truths that you have for them in a way that will really transform them and cause them to be agents of transformation of others and of their communities. Thank you very much.